This is the Bruchim Podcast, the only podcast in the world dedicated to Jews who think differently about circumcision. Previously on the Bruchim Podcast.
And of course, there are issues with trans halakhah that who is actually chayav is obligated by brit milah, and I will let more learned colleagues deal with that.
Welcome back to the Bruchim Podcast. I'm your host, Eli Sargon, and joining me from New Haven, Connecticut is my co-host, Max Duboff. Max, how's it going today?
Going well. It's a beautiful sunny day to be talking about circumcision, you know.
And joining us from Queens, New York is our special guest today, Brin Solomon. Brin, welcome to the Bruchim Podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Hello. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So Brin is the author of tshuva. Tshuva is the word for responsum. I think the English translation of tshuva is responsum, and that is a genre of Jewish legal discourse that goes back hundreds of years. And the name of this responsum, which we are going to be discussing today, is Conversion and Circumcision, a Trans Approach. But before we jump into all of that, Brin, please tell us a little bit about yourself, how you come to this subject, and how you came to write this essay.
Sure. So in general, out in the wider world, I'm a composer and bassoonist. I write musicals and plays and make theater. In the Jewish world specifically, I do a lot of liturgical work around both gender and using non-binary Hebrew to explore different approaches to prayer, but also thinking about ableism and xenophobia and sexism and other things that wind up in the liturgy that maybe we don't want to carry forward with us as we move into the future. In terms of this teshuva specifically, the wonderful folks at Savara were putting together a teshuva writing collective, the trans teshuva writing collective, specifically because there are a lot of areas in halakha that deal with gender and that trans people have complicated relationships with, and many Jewish legal decisions that get made about trans issues are not made by trans people. And so Savara really wanted to be like, all right, these are things that really directly affect trans people's lives. Let's actually hear what trans people have to say about them instead of having someone who's not trans and maybe doesn't even know any trans people write their opinions on it. So I submitted a proposal to write this teshuva, and it was accepted, and I wrote it. And in terms of how I came to writing it, it's something that I really encountered a lot in my own conversion process. I converted several years ago at this point, but as part of that process, you know, I talked with many rabbis, and I was, connected to many synagogues, and I kept encountering these conversion, so traditionally, for conversion, circumcision is required if that is the kind of body that you have. And many synagogues, especially synagogues that understand their mission to be serving LGBT Jews, have varying ways of grappling with this, because it is often understood as like men must be circumcised. But if you're trying to understand trans Jews, then there's this question of like, well, does men mean the gender? So are we trying to figure out how like trans men are going to be circumcised? Does it refer strictly to anatomy? In which case, are we treating trans women as men? So there's a lot of Sturm und Drang is perhaps overstating it. But there's a lot of many shuls have very different approaches to this. And I found myself often frustrated by their policies, which I think, I want to be very generous. I think they were written from a place of really wanting to be inclusive and not wanting to misgender or do harm to people. But the results were policies that were often very vague or confusing and sort of had a little element of like, choose your own adventure, but also we might not like your adventure, so talk to us. I don't know. And I'm someone who likes rules. I like knowing what the rules are. So I was very frustrated by that personally. And so when the chance to sort of write about gender and halakha came up, I was like, this is what I want to write about.
Amazing. Max, before we jump into the tshuva itself, I don't think I did an adequate job of explaining to our audience the genre of teshuva and what this sort of form of literature is. Could you just give a quick primer on that before we actually jump into Brin's excellent tshuva?
Yeah, totally. So Teshuva literature, or She'ela Utshuva, as the sort of full name is, question and answer literature, is a way of trying to address questions that come up in the practice of halakha in Jewish law. And so in its most traditional form, someone in a community would ask a question to a rabbi, and the rabbi would sort of write about it and maybe publish their response, and possibly also would write to other rabbis asking for their thoughts. But one does not have to be a rabbi at all to write teshuvot. And so definitely some teshuvot today are by folks who aren't rabbis. And there's been a real broadening of teshuvah literature. We have teshuvot these days that are published by various rabbinical organizations, both Orthodox and not Orthodox. And I think Svara's Trans-Halakhah Project's Teshuvah Writing Collective is just super exciting for really expanding this genre of teshuvah literature. And in teshuvot, we have some that are more technical and legal, and we have some that are more kind of dealing with big picture issues. And one of the things I really like about brin's teshuvah that we're going to discuss today is that it's really grappling with a lot of important issues from a variety of perspectives. And one thing that you do tend to see also in many teshuvot is trying to settle meta-halakhah questions, right? Questions about like how we should view halakha, Jewish law itself. And we often need to address those questions before we're able to talk about the details of Jewish law that apply in various individual cases.
Max, that was brilliant. I think I'm going to have to knight you the summarizer in chief going forward. Let's sort of dive in. And I think it would be helpful for our audience if we started by talking about the problem that you were dealing with. You alluded to it a little bit before, Brin, that there was a dissatisfaction and a kind of discomfort around conversion and trans issues. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and then also talk about the manner in which the current attempts to address these concerns halachically have been failing.
Yeah. So I think it's probably most helpful to sort of start with the traditional understanding of circumcision and conversion. So this is a discussion that goes all the way back to the Babylonian Talmud, which gets codified around the year 500 AD, although it is a complicated document. And the rabbis sort of talk about okay, someone wants to become Jewish who is not Jewish. How does that happen? And the conversation that they have about this is complicated, and we can certainly get into it, but the conclusion that sort of gets settled on is, so if you're a man, by which they understand if you have a penis, you have to be circumcised and then immerse in a mikvah, which is a Jewish ritual bath. Basically, you dunk 3 times, you say some blessings, you're Jewish. If you're a woman, by which they mean a cis woman, you don't have to be circumcised, you just have to immerse in the mikvah, say the same blessings, shazam, you're Jewish. Because of that framing that they come up with, conversion has really been understood as a bifurcated gendered process, where if you're a man, you do this, if you're a woman, you do that. And so coming into the current US moment, when we have a very different understanding of gender than that, I think a lot of queer inclusive shulls have been grappling with this question of if we treat conversion as strictly a gendered process, and we want all men to be circumcised, then we have this category of men who don't have penises, and what does circumcision mean for them? And then also we have this category of women who have penises, and are we comfortable saying yeah, you can be a woman with a foreskin and convert to Judaism and that's fine? And then so that's sort of the overarching question. And I think many places have sort of tried to split the difference. I found it unsatisfying both in terms of being non-binary, and many of these teshuvot sort of assume either you're a man or you're a woman, and I'm I'm not either. Do I have to be this much of a man for the halakha? You must be this tall to ride the ride? Where do I have to fall on the man-woman sliding scale before these exemptions start to kick in? And I also found it frustrating in that it sort of carves genders up according to bodies, and in ways that I think reflect and enact, or at least perpetuate, ways that trans people have been degendered by transphobia because of our bodies.
This is really, really helpful. And I think something that's quite instructive about circumcision and part of why it's so fascinating, right, is that it's where the anatomical and the social meet in a way. I'm not saying it's the only such practice. I think we could make a lot of comparisons with nida, with practices around menstruation as well, but that's for another time. But with circumcision, right, we have this idea of, in the rabbinic mind, that males have a higher social role with something on male anatomy. But the sort of question is raised today, and people have talked about this with practices related to menstruation, and not as much with circumcision. How can we kind of figure out whether today we're able to separate an anatomical practice from a sort of history that it has, which might be unappealing in some way because of unjust or inegalitarian baggage?
Absolutely. I think one of the most persuasive parts of the tshuva to me was when you were outlining the manner in which the approaches that exist in halakha to try and address some of these issues fail in two directions. So I was wondering if you could sort of recap that for our audience, because I think it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, this is like the first half of my teshuva, where I'm sort of like getting us to the crisis point that I then try to resolve in the second half. So if you take an approach that only treats gender, that like pays no attention to bodies, you often wind up excluding people who don't fit neatly into one gender category or another. So if you're like, men do this, women do that, then you wind up excluding people who are like, well, I don't know whether I am a man or a woman. Or if someone converts as a woman and then realizes that they're a man, or starts, people's genders, they can have new revelations about them. They can come to new understandings of them. And then retroactively, are they like, well, now I'm a man, but I didn't convert as a man. Do I need to reconvert? And like, that's a whole mess. And then on the flip side, if you only look at sex, if you say we're not worrying about the social aspect of it at all, we're just like looking at bodies, there are a lot of different kinds of human bodies. There are a lot of different ways that human bodies can be, even when it comes to genitals. And so then you wind up with this question of like, okay, we have this like model of like the normative penis, but like, if someone is sort of like that, but not entirely like that, then what do we do with them? And now suddenly, if someone wants to convert, we have to like ask all of these complicated questions about like, I need to know the exact size of your genitals. And like, I'm going to be real, that seems bad. I don't think that's a good halakhic system where we need to like measure people's genitals. That is like big red flags for me. And also raises the question of like, okay, like again, someone converts and then down the line has surgery on their genitals and now has a different kind of genital situation. Does that retroactively question the validity of their conversion? And, especially like there's a lot of research in like different surgical techniques and different ways of reconfiguring the genital area, both for trans people, but also for cis people who want it for whatever reason. And, down the line, there may be surgeries that like aren't possible today, but that become possible that raise new problems if we're only looking at bodies. So if you only look at sex, if you only look at gender, either way, there are these categories of people who wind up being excluded. And I think very significantly, many of the people in these categories are people who are already frequently excluded and marginalized in society, which means that whichever approach you take, you're sort of enacting transphobia or interphobia or some other marginalization in ways that I think halakha should not do.
I just want to emphasize this because we're talking in abstractions. I want to be as concrete as possible. So what you're saying is if a trans person is converting and they're a trans woman, but they still have a penis, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the halakhic approach to deal with that is we're only looking at the body part, therefore they either need to have a circumcision or a hatafat on brit, or let's just say they need to have a circumcision because they have a penis. That's not taking into consideration the fact that the person doesn't consider themselves male, and it's going to raise all sorts of complicated things for them at a very sensitive time in their conversion journey. So that's on the one hand.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, let's say you have a person who is non-binary and they're converting, and we're saying, okay, because of all those problems that we just talked about with the person who has a penis but is a woman, we're not going to talk about body parts at all. we're just going to talk about gender. So now we have a non-binary person who's converting, and we're going to insist on gender. Well, for that person, they're also going to be out of luck because now you're focusing on gender, but their gender doesn't fit into the binary. So am I getting this right? This is sort of the problem as you stated in your tshuva, yeah?
I would say yes, and because I do want to foreground the intersex aspect of this. This is something that I think is often left out of these conversations, but I do think is very important because there are people with ambiguous genitalia. And if you're only focusing on the body, then suddenly you're having to ask a lot of very invasive questions about their genitalia. And also you very seriously run the risk of like enacting interphobia against them. And our society is very, very hostile to people whose bodies do not match the like Western science sex binary of like what a male or female body should be. And I think that is something that it's very important that halakha does not reproduce.
Yeah, well, I think this is a fantastic transition to start getting into some of your argument, Brin. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to add on these sorts of methodological preliminaries?
I just want to highlight that it's important on its own terms, right? But it's also an important conversation sort of broadly written for how do we deal with situations in which the traditional tools that we have had until this point are no longer serving actual Jewish people in the world. And to me, that's kind of where this goes from being an important sort of niche topic to like an actual thing that everyone who cares about Jewish identity needs to think about.
I will say that I think I certainly owe an intellectual debt to this teshuva called Halakha and meta-halakhah arguments concerning homosexuality.
Truly one of my favorites, an incredible text, by Rabbi Gordon Tucker,
And absolutely amazing. So this is from, again, the Committee for Jewish Law and Standards when they were discussing whether to, I think the phrasing they came up with was like legitimate homosexuality halakhically. And this teshuva, I'm going to summarize it very quickly, essentially makes the argument that like morally, it is clear that like halakha cannot continue to stigmatize gay and lesbian relationships. Also, if you look at traditional halakhic tools, they just do not offer the tools to remove the ban that comes from traditional halakhic understandings. Therefore, it is necessary to like use new halakhic tools to get to the place that we know we need to get to. That is a text that I come back to regularly and has had a very deep impact on my understanding of halakha and Judaism and the importance of like the pikuach nefesh verse is like, by my laws you should live. And I always come back to like the point of halakha is to serve Jewish flourishing. It is not the point of Jewish flourishing to serve halakha.
Yeah, no, indeed. I'm so glad that you brought up that teshuva, Brin. As I said, it really is one of my favorites. And also that teshuva really inspired some of Eli's and my conversations in season 1 of the Bruchim podcast as well, when we were talking about the relationship between ethics and halakha. We didn't mention that teshuva specifically, but we were going through different sorts of positions that one might take when ethics and halakha seem to conflict. And Eli was defending the position that ethics has to trump in these sorts of situations. And I was defending the position that, well, ultimately ethics and halakha won't really conflict when we understand them properly, which relates to, also the need for halakhic creativity. But in any case, both of those positions think that when something in the halakha feels like it can't possibly be right, then that means something, right? And, we should really be suspicious of the halakha. And I think that, is really going to set up for some of the further arguments in your teshuva, which really rely on a lot of these methodological discussions.
Max, Brin is on my team when it comes to conflicts of ethics and halakha.
It's true, yeah.
As we will prove, but in order to prove that, we need to get to the meat of the tshuva. So why don't we do that? Why don't we talk about what to my lights almost felt like a philosophical formulation of how you get from A to Z.
I'm guilty of taking philosophy courses in undergrad, and it definitely shows.
Yeah, I mean, I made like a sort of 12-step reconstruction of your argument, which I'd be happy to kind of go through. Or if maybe, Bryn, if you just want to start by summarizing your argument a bit, and then I think maybe all the detailed steps will come out as we discuss how you reach some of your conclusions.
Yeah, but now, Max, I have to revoke my knightship for you. 12 steps is not a summary, but please go on, Bryn.
So in the broadest sense, part one of the teshuva, as I said, is sort of bringing us to the crisis point of like dealing with gender, dealing with sex, dealing with both of them, however you try to do it. Like, there seems to be no way forward. And so part two is trying to like find a way forward through this. And so I start by looking at the other like major source of circumcision in Jewish law, which is newborn babies. And what does the halakha have to say about Jewish newborns, and how does that work? Because if we can understand how it works for them, maybe that is something we can then carry back into the realm of conversion. And so I sort of go through the halakhic sources of like, where does this commandment come from for newborns? How has it been understood? What have the exceptions to it been? And one of the major exceptions to circumcising newborn infants who have a penis is in the case of, they don't use the word hemophilia. It is generally understood in contemporary sources to be families that like hemophilia runs in the family, but it is basically, if you know it is going to be very risky for the health of this 8-day-old infant child, you do not have to circumcise them. So if circumcision is impossible because of it is a medical danger, then you don't have to do it. That's for someone who's born Jewish. And so I sort of say, well, that's interesting. Because it seems that there's a category where we're already saying like, all right, we like can't really do this. And then I sort of zoom in on that like medically prohibited. Because in the Talmud, they're very talking about like, oh, if they're just going to like bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed to death. That's an example that they give. But of course, someone being hemophiliac isn't the only reason that a procedure could be medically prohibited. There are lots of reasons, actually, that a doctor might say, like, I can't do this surgery. And so then I start to talk about and draw from the wealth of like intersex advocacy who make, I think, a very persuasive argument that non-consensual cosmetic genital surgery on infants who cannot consent to medical procedures is like fundamentally unethical. Like there is a fundamental ethical violation. And so then I say like, okay, like if it's unethical, then you can't do it. And like we have this tradition of like, if you can't do circumcision because of medical ethics, here's what to do instead. And it's this ritual called hatafat brit. And so I'm like, okay, we can't do circumcision on newborns because of medical ethics. Then if we're already going to be bringing in Jewish newborns by this ritual called hatafat brit, let's just bring that over to conversion and say like, we're doing hatafat brit across the board. We're not worried about what gender you are. We're not worried about what genitals you have. We're not slicing and dicing the gender of sex pie at all. This is just, you're a person and you're converting. Great. Here's what we do. And then I talk a little bit more about that ritual and how it should be done and look at some, I think, for me, very interesting sources from the Talmud that discuss sort of that question and then round it out by suggesting a blessing for it. And that's my conclusion.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So I'd love to talk about some of the earlier steps and then to dig in a little bit for the ritual you propose, which I think is just absolutely fascinating and really worth discussion.
But first, I summarize in 3 steps. Step 1, any infant may grow up to be a man. Therefore, circumcision is required of all Jewish infants. Step 2, from the intersex case, we understand that non-consensual cosmetic surgeries on infants are unethical. Therefore, circumcision is impossible. Step 3, hatafat brit should fulfill the mitzvah of circumcision. But I do want to point out that in this first step of the argument that you're making here, right, that what you're doing is actually elegantly, completely sidestepping some of the issues that Max has talked about for a long time around egalitarianism, because you're basically saying, well, because we don't know what an infant is, what their gender is going to turn out to be, well, then obviously everyone has to be included in this group that has to be circumcised. That's step 1, right?
Right, which relies on, and I think this is one of my favorite parts of the teshuvah, relies on this principle, right, that in cases of uncertainty for circumcision, we incline towards strictness, right? Someone might think, oh, well, we can't be certain, so we shouldn't do it. But Brit, no, actually, you really invert this and say, no, based on this traditional principle, actually, we should be strict, and that sort of sets up for this sort of universalizing practice of circumcision or hatafat brit.
But then we get to the part where we learn that Brin is on my team, Max.
You're really pushing this line, aren't you, Ellie?
I'm going to prove it, because what Brin learns from the intersex case is that indeed non-consensual cosmetic surgeries on infants are unethical. And the assumption here in the tshuva is if we find something to be unethical and it conflicts with a halakhic requirement, the ethics trump. Am I getting that right, Brin?
Well, I'm going to caveat that because the traditional halakhic understanding does already have room for it's unethical to circumcise. And so in some ways, like, I think in my heart, I am very sympathetic to you, but I think what I'm saying in the teshuvah is much more narrowly construed in that there is already this traditionally halakhically sanctioned alternate path, and I'm saying we should follow that path. Does that make sense as a distinction?
Well, I'm not sure I get. So maybe you can say a little bit more about. So you think that hatafat brit is an alternative that's coming from ethical concerns? Because to me, it's not. My understanding from reading your tshuva, Brin, is not that hatafat brit is an alternative because people have ethical concerns about circumcision. I think that's a move that you're making, right? That, like, if you have ethical concerns about circumcision, hatafat brit might be an alternative. Am I missing something?
Well, I would say that in the case of where circumcision is dangerous to the health of the infant, that is a case that traditional halakha recognizes. But
then you just don't do anything.
Well, there are some halakhic authorities that would say that, like, if hatafat brit is not dangerous in the same way, that is done in that case too.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you're saying because those halakhic authorities take that stance. Okay, so that's a nuance that I wasn't familiar with. That's really interesting. So you're saying that there are halakhic decisors who, in cases where circumcision is contraindicated for the health of the baby, will still suggest hatafat brit in lieu of circumcision.
Yeah, and I also think it's, like, in the larger sense, hatafat brit is done when circumcision, for whatever reason, is impossible. I would argue, and I think that this is substantiatable from traditional sources, although perhaps not foregrounded, that medical ethics constitute an impossibility. In much the same way that, like, if it is impossible for you to fast because it would be dangerous, like, it's not that it's physically impossible for you to not eat food on Yom Kippur, but it is ethically impermissible. It becomes impossible, and then you must eat.
Aha! Did you hear that, Max? I think that constitutes my position.
Yeah. Well, possibly.
But that's a halakhic position. That's a long-sanctioned halakhic position.
Yeah, I mean, one distinction which we might want to make also, right, is, the question of what's impossible versus what's undesirable, right? So, one, I think, way of putting this in the case of fasting, right? So on Yom Kippur and other Jewish fast days is this question of, if your two alternatives are to fast and to stay in bed all day, or to not fast and to be able to go to shul and participate in other practices related to a holiday, which one should be chosen, right? And so, we might have this question of, if someone is able to fast in some way, but would be really undesirable for other reasons, should we say that they should fast? And so we might have this, analogous position with circumcision as well. We might say something like, well, even if it's not fully ethically impermissible in all cases, we might say something like, for various reasons, we consider it really ethically undesirable. And I think that might also be enough to want to move away from the practice of routine circumcision, at least.
But Brin, you're resting this on a halakhic category of impossibility, right? That's a key part of your argument here.
Yes, I would say so. Although I think that, as in the case of fasting on Yom Kippur, halakhic impossibility is an expansive concept and not I think has often been interpreted expansively. I'm non-binary. I don't like teams.
Yeah, no, that's great. There's this really, really interesting move, right? So, so far we're at the stage in the argument of this conclusion that everyone should undergo hatafat dam brit in some sense, right? That hatafat dam brit sort of can apply in all cases, make sense in all cases, and then this is getting into the argument for, Bryn, your specific ritual suggestion. There's this idea, which I think is really fascinating, that circumcision or hatafat dam brit should be performed in, and this is from the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Shabbat, page 108a, quote, the place that distinguishes between maleness and femaleness, right? And so this is traditionally, interpreted as the penis in rabbinic thought, but you have a different idea, right, for where this is coming from. Can you tell us a little bit about then how this sets up for your final proposal?
Totally. So there's sort of like two roots to the same trunk of this argument. One root is sort of a very contemporary understanding of gender that says, like, I can't tell you what makes me the gender that I am, but I can tell you that I feel it very strongly. And like when I am asking someone, their pronouns, what gender they are, how they want to be referred to, like I'm asking for what feels best to them. Like, and for me, like what distinguishes between maleness and femaleness is like what a person knows is true about themselves. It is self-knowledge, and self-knowledge can come from analysis. It can come from intuition. It can come from revelatory dreams. It can come from all of these places. But I think poetically in English, we feel things in our heart about ourselves. And I think that's a long-standing traditional usage. And I think there is no reason to be hyper-rationalist about it. And we can like embrace that and say like the place that distinguishes maleness and femaleness is the heart. Like that it's what you feel, it's where you feel it. And then the sort of second trunk is there's another passage in the Talmud where they're talking about like, where does circumcision happen? And this one person uses a fairly complicated pun-based argument to argue that it should be over the heart, that is where circumcision should be done. And so I'm like, all right, look, like this is a minority opinion, but I'm taking it forward and I'm adopting it as my own.
And adopting minority opinions definitely has a lot of precedent in halakha as well. That's one of the really cool things, that we have minority opinions and they can sort of resurface in different eras.
Mm-hmm. So just to be clear, the suggestion that you're making is that people draw a symbolic drop of blood a literal drop of blood from over their heart. And yes, that's the tshuva ultimately, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're recommending that this be done to 8-day-old infants and to converts to Judaism.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think this is an absolutely fascinating proposal. And I'll just say that, one of the things that I really hope we see more of in the sort of general ballpark of circumcision is more creative ritual and more suggestions. And your suggestion here, Bryn, is kind of similar to a teshuvah by Jericho Vincent that we can link in the show notes, where Jericho also, has something like hatafat dam brit from the palm, right? So, sort of another part of the body. So I'm really interested in these sorts of alternative rituals and sort of playing with and adapting various traditional practices. But one thing I really would love to get your perspective on is, how can we continue to have blood play this important role when blood is so associated with the penis and also with maybe maleness in rabbinic thought, or maybe you don't think it is, but it at least seems to me at sort of like first glance like the blood aspect of circumcision is not really separable from the penis aspect of circumcision.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a fair question, and I think I can't promise I'll have the most satisfying answer to it. It's something that I feel like I'm still wrestling with. I think in terms of the blood aspect of it, blood has a lot of different important symbolic roles to play in various layers and eras of Judaism, whether that's, the blood of circumcision, TM, but also like the blood of atonement that gets sprinkled on the altar and the parochet in the temple, and when the temple was happening. There's also a lot of halakha around, nida and the blood of menstruation. So I think while there are certainly aspects of it that do feel strongly gendered, I also think that like blood as a substance, like we all have it. You don't magically lose all your blood when you transition. And I feel able to, let's say, stake the claim that like blood can be understood in a non-gendered way. And this is sort of where I start thinking about like the prefigurative aspect to it, because I do think that like in the current moment, hatafat brit is understood as a male ritual. And my hope is twofold. My hope is that by moving it to the heart, it severs that connection to the genitals in ways that serve to degender it. And my hope is also that, like, if this is something that becomes widely adopted, it will also lose the sociological associations with maleness that it has in, I think, much the same way that, like, in many communities, although I'm not going to say all, but in many communities, wearing a tallis is not particularly strongly gendered. Tefillin, I think, are still fairly strongly gendered, but every shul that I have been to in the morning service, you'll see men wearing talitot, you'll see women wearing talitot, you'll see non-binary people wearing talitot. It's not a marker of gender in the way that like wearing a suit and tie are. And so I think that is an example of like, we can take things that were strongly gendered and by living them, make them not strongly gendered. Again, that doesn't mean that in this moment it doesn't have that baggage, but my hope is that we can leave that baggage behind.
No, I think it's really fantastic, right? And a way to strengthen your proposal, I think, right, would be thinking about how we can bring some of these other resonances of blood from our tradition into maybe our hatafat brit ceremonies and rituals and sort of like ways of approaching this practice.
So my concern here is around, and again, I think this is a brilliant tshuva. I really enjoyed. I read it twice. I thought it was great. My concern is not so much as this for potential converts to Judaism who are making a decision for themselves about their body, but my concern is about the infant side of this, because I think an assumption that's being made here is that hatafat brit does not run afoul of medical ethics. And I'm not entirely sure that that is the case. One of our colleagues, Max Buckler, has recently written a really brilliant essay about hatafat brit, trying to problematize the normal medical ethical discussions that we have around circumcision. But I would just say that, in a sort of summarized fashion, the idea of hatafat brit, of taking a ceremonial drop of blood from an infant, no matter where it is, whether it's the penis or any other part of the body, is actually, in a way, a kind of dignitary harm. That, in a way, what you're doing is you're saying, I am your parent, so I get to do this thing to your body, which is symbolic. And in a way, I'm using your body as a means to my ends of religious identification. And I don't think it's an open and shut case that is ethically permissible on its face. And that's sort of so again, like, I would draw a very sharp, bright line between doing this for an adult who's consenting to it and doing it on an infant who's not consenting.
Listen, I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I think there are several things I would say in response to it. I think that in some ways, whether you do anything physically or not, deciding to raise a child as a Jew and like deciding to raise a child in your culture is already making a lot of decisions for them that they cannot make. Deciding what you're going to feed them, deciding where they're going to live, deciding what they're going to, like, there are all of these decisions that get made. And I think that I am very sympathetic to this idea that like, until someone can like make an affirmative choice that they want to be a Jew, like, you can't really treat them as a Jew. And also, I don't think it is possible to not raise a child with a culture, and like, they need to eat something. They need to wear something. They need to like, you can't just like put them in a void and then they come out when they're 18 and have opinions about the world.
Sure, but we do have, like, for example, if we look at laws around female genital cutting practices, this would be illegal in our current legal system to do to an infant female for cultural reasons, right? So
yes.
Like we do.
No, and there are limits on it, right? No, so obviously there are limits on this, and there should be limits on this. My point is that the limits can't be, a parent can never make a decision for their child or can never like foreclose possibilities for their child, because that is, I think, physically impossible in the world.
Sure, granted.
I think so, like, and then another thing that I would like to say, like, I'm hooking things together. This is a way I often move between ideas. There are certainly times where, like, I think parents should vaccinate their children. And that involves inflicting pain on a child. Like there is a momentary pain. There is often a little bit of blood comes out. And also I think that the benefits to vaccination, which needs to be done at a certain time in a person's life, dramatically outweigh the harms. And I am very unsympathetic to the idea that it is unethical to vaccinate a small child against the measles. And I think for me, that opens up this space of like, what is the amount of harm of like taking a small symbolic action that inflicts a small amount of pain, but that doesn't permanently physically change the body in any way?
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with you on the vaccination thing. I just think that there's some really important differences between vaccination and hatafat and brit.
No, I do. And that's where I'm going, where I think there is this question of what is the amount of harm inflicted, both physical and also dignitary, as you say, versus there is also, I think, a harm in having your Jewish status be uncertain and having it be ambiguous or conflicted. And I don't know that I am certain about how to weigh those harms. I don't know that I have gotten it right exactly in weighing those harms. And I think I am certainly open to the idea that, it shouldn't be this symbolic thing at all. It should be another thing. And I'm certainly open to that and curious what things people propose. I personally, my intuition is that the harm of hatafat and brit over the heart is small, and is small enough that the sort of dignitary benefits of full belonging and membership in a community outweigh it. But I certainly acknowledge that not everyone is necessarily going to have that intuition or is going to balance those scales the same way.
Yeah, no, I think this is fantastic. And I think we're running up here against two different issues. One of them is the limits of halakhic change, right? So if we have a halakhic system and we think there are certain kinds of rules of the game, then different people are going to think at different points that we've hit the limit, maybe, of how much is desirable to change. So that's one thing. I'm not saying, Bryn, that you're necessarily saying that we're coming up against the limits here, but one of the things you do seem to be doing in your argument is trying to use categories that are native to halakha and work within some of those categories. So that's one thing. Then the other question is, how big is the benefit? How substantial is the benefit of having some kind of ritual, at least analogous to circumcision or hatafat and brit, related to welcoming someone into Judaism, right? You know, what sort of role does this ritual play as opposed to things like naming and sort of verbally welcoming someone, right? And so I think to evaluate different rituals, we also need to have a sense of why we're doing these rituals and, you know, sort of how big a deal it is that we're doing these rituals. And that's a really big question that we're not going to answer today, but something to think through.
Traditionally, right, like there is an ontological aspect to it, like in like the. And I mean, this gets tricky, right? Like, there's this question of like, I guess that's actually a question. Is there an ontological aspect to it? Like, does this ceremony in some ways change your halakhic status? I think that it is often understood as changing your halakhic status. And that is obviously a matter of belief and a matter of religion and a matter that cannot be settled by empirical analysis. We can't like have the halakha meter that we like beep, 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 and scan you and figure out your halakhic status. But I also think it is something that does have philosophical force for people. I think there are people, I certainly know people who feel great distress when their halakhic status as Jews or as members of a Jewish community, when they feel that it is questioned, when they question it themselves. And just to flag that as like something that like, and you know, I know people, I've not personally like taught young Jewish children in Hebrew school, but I have many friends who have, and who many of their students who are very young do feel strongly that they are Jewish and do feel strongly that like they are part of this people and this religion and this community, however you want to understand being Jewish. And I think, you know, many of these kids, I think, would be very upset if you were like, well, you're not yet. Like, no, you're not actually. Halakhically, you're not. So I do want to make the case that like there is a harm there, and that there is a benefit to averting that harm.
I don't see it that way.
Okay.
Specifically, no, I just want to like be clear about where my disagreement is here. I think the rabbis did away with the ontological thing. I think it was very much a thing in the Second Temple period. You can see it in the Book of Jubilees. You can see it in other Jewish texts from the Second Temple period. I think the rabbis were very, very clear that this is no longer what makes a person Jewish, and that matrilineal descent is the be-all and end-all from a rabbinic perspective at that time. And, if we sort of zoom forward to our current era, the other denominations have expanded that even further, right? So in the Reform movement, it's non-lineal, right? Jewish identity is non-lineal. But the point I'm making is very simple, which is you could go to the strictest Orthodox rabbi in the world today and say, I had a boy, I'm Jewish, my mother's Jewish, I had a boy, and the boy is not circumcised. Is that person Jewish? They will unequivocally, without exception, say yes, that person is Jewish.
But this is actually, as Ellie, we've discussed before in various ways, this is a topic, an issue where birth differs from conversion, right? For conversion, for someone who has a penis, the traditional interpretation is that circumcision is part of what makes them Jewish, and that someone can't become Jewish with a penis without circumcision, right? And so, I think one...
No, that's absolutely right, Max. But my issue with Brin is not about the conversion.
No, it's about
well, but no, I get that that's not your issue. But my point is that, I think it's worth distinguishing here, right? So Brin's suggestion is for both birth and conversion. But there might also be someone who would want to adopt the suggestion for conversion only and, might be less comfortable with it for birth. And it could still work that way. And maybe this distinction of, sort of the ontological implications, we might say, of circumcision should lead us to have a different ritual. That I don't think Brin thinks that, but someone else might think that.
I also think that, to defend my claim, which I'm not necessarily going to die on this hill, but I think I do want to have it out just to get to the heart of it. I think that sure, there's what the halakha says if you're yes, you are technically Jewish, and then there's how you are treated. Because I do think, and this is drawing again on some of the Mishneh sources that I cited, that there is a very strong thread of disgust at foreskins in the halakhic tradition. And I think that I'm certain that there are people who would be yeah, you're a baby born to a Jewish mother, you weren't circumcised, you're halakhically Jewish, also your body is wrong. Also, you are not correct as a Jew. And I think that even if there is not a halakhic ontological aspect to it, there is still a stigma. And that stigma, I think, is a harm that in this realm that we are talking about. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. I don't know that I agree. I arrive at the same conclusion. I agree with there's a stigma. I agree that it's rooted in rabbinic texts. I agree that people treat Jews with foreskins in ways that they shouldn't be treated. All that I agree with. I just don't make that extra step to, therefore, But this has been amazing and wonderful. And thank you so much for participating in this discussion with us. Thank you so much for your tshuva. Where can people find your work, beyond the tshuva?
Yeah. So if you're interested in my liturgical work, I have my Siddur website is inclusivesiddur.com. If you're interested in following up on more of my musical and theatrical work, brinsolomon.com will have it all. And if you want to sort of get real-time updates from all of my projects in your inbox every third month or whenever I remember to do it, I have a little newsletter sign up that you can find on my website. And I also want to thank you both for having me, but also very insightful comments and critiques. I always have this fear of writing, that writing is so final and makes it sound like I think everything in stone. And it is always a pleasure to have a chance to talk and to let ideas be fluid and to rethink things in real time. And I always want to be doing that in life. And so thank you for giving us space to do that here.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that, because I was going to say something similar as well, that I gained so much from your tshuva, but I also gained so much from this conversation. It was a real privilege to be able to discuss this with you, Brin. It was so rich.
And I just want to end by quoting Brin to Brin, because this was my absolute favorite piece of the tshuva, and I would be remiss if the audience didn't hear this. We hope for a future where we can all bob around the gender ocean in peace, where the categories of cis and trans become much less salient or even legible than they are today. I just thought that was such a beautiful hope for the future.
Amen.
Next time on the Bruchim Podcast.
What weight do we give to a cultural or a religious rationale versus an aesthetic rationale versus a parental preference? How do we weigh these things?
This, I think, is the really important and difficult question. And I have thought a lot about male circumcision in various parts of my work, and I have thought and written quite a bit about religious practices in other books, not so much in Intact. So in Intact I focus on secular practice, but I have thought and written a lot about religious practices and the weight we give to those in other work. It's a very difficult and complicated question.
Thank you for listening to the Bruchim Podcast. If you like what you've heard here, you may also like our YouTube series, Circumcision Texts in the Jewish Tradition, where Max and I are studying all of the major circumcision texts in chronological order. If you find value in this content, please consider supporting our organization at bruchim.online. That's BRUCHIM.online. We're a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to email us at info@bruchim.online. Lehitraot.